The power conduit housing came loose with the same quarter turn it always did. A small resistance, and then a click I felt through the wrench more than I heard. I set the fastener aside on the deck plate, where it wouldn't roll, and pulled the inspection panel free. The conduit beneath ran the length of the engineering deck's port side, a thick bundle of insulated cabling and coolant lines sheathed in an alloy casing that vibrated faintly under my palm. The vibration was normal. I'd logged it twice already this month, cross-referenced the frequency against the manufacturer's tolerance band, and found it dead center. The ship hummed at 62 Hz through this section. It had hummed at 62 Hz when I came aboard 18 months ago, and if I did my job, it would hum at 62 Hz when my shift ended. I ran the diagnostic scanner along the conduit's length, watching the readout populate on my datapad. Voltage steady at 98.3% of rated capacity. Thermal output within half a degree of baseline. Insulation resistance clean. The numbers were a kind of language I didn't have to translate anymore. I saw the figures and felt the system behind them, the way someone else might hear a few bars of music and know the whole song. Behind me, the engineering deck stretched aft in a long corridor of consoles and access hatches, lit by the flat white panels that ran overhead in unbroken strips. The air carried the faint, scorched sweet smell of recycled coolant and the lower, earthier note of lubricant warming in the portside bearing housings. I'd stopped noticing it months ago, except when something changed. Nothing had changed today. I heard Vale before I saw him. The chief's boots had a particular rhythm on the deck, grating, heavier on the heel than most, and he never slowed for corners. I straightened as he came around the conduit junction, a datapad in one hand and a stylus tucked behind his ear. Mercer. Chief. He stopped long enough to glance at my open panel, then at the scanner readout on my datapad. His face was weathered in the way of someone who'd spent more years in engine rooms than out of them. The skin around his eyes creased from squinting at displays too small and manuals too old. He didn't smile. Vale almost never smiled, and when he did, it meant something had gone wrong, and he'd figured out how to fix it before anyone else. Port Conduit 3? Scheduled inspection. Everything's within spec. He nodded once, the same terse acknowledgement he'd given me 100 times before, and kept walking. I watched him go for a moment, then turned back to my work. Vale had been aboard the Resolute Dawn for 6 years. He'd trained half the engineering crew, me included, and he still checked every report I filed as if he expected to find a decimal point out of place. He never did, but he kept checking anyway. I decided early on that the checking wasn't about me. It was about the ship. The ship came first, and Vale made sure everyone who worked under him understood that. I reseated the conduit housing and torqued the fasteners to spec, then moved to the next section. The manual I'd been consulting earlier sat open on the console beside the junction box, a physical binder printed on fireproof stock, because the regs still required a hard copy backup for critical systems. The page was dog-eared at the power distribution schematic for decks 4 through 7. I didn't need it. I kept it open anyway, a habit Vale had drilled into me during my first week aboard. Always have the reference visible, even if you've memorized it, because the one time you don't is the one time you'll need it. The ship's comms crackled overhead. Engineering, this is Sato. Status on the number 2 coolant loop. Lieutenant Commander Sato's voice came through the speaker with the same calm, unhurried cadence it always carried. She didn't ask questions she didn't already know the answer to, which meant she was confirming something for the log or for the bridge. I keyed the nearest panel. Loop 2 is green, Commander. Pressure holding at nominal. Vale signed off on it at 0600. Copy. Continue with scheduled inspections. The channel closed. I let my hand rest on the console for a moment, feeling the faint vibration of the ship's systems through the metal. The Resolute Dawn was a frigate, not a carrier or a cruiser, and her engineering deck was compact enough that I could walk from one end to the other in under a minute. I knew every panel, every conduit run, every junction box and pressure valve. I knew which deck plates creaked underfoot and which ones didn't, which coolant lines ran warm to the touch and which stayed cold. The knowledge was granular and complete, and it gave me something I didn't have a word for. Not quite safety, something closer to certainty. I finished the portside inspection and logged the results, then headed forward toward the comm station to check the environmental telemetry feed. The corridor narrowed past the reactor housing, the ceiling dropping half a meter, where a secondary coolant trunk ran overhead. I ducked without thinking about it, another motion that had become automatic. Lena Ortiz sat at the comm station with her back to me, her shoulders framed by the glow of 3 displays arranged in a tight arc. She had short cropped hair and a posture that suggested she'd been at the console for hours and would be there for hours more. I heard the soft clatter of her keyboard before I saw her face. "Morning," I said. She didn't turn. "Daniel." I leaned against the bulkhead beside her station, close enough to see the data scrolling across her center screen. Encrypted traffic, most of it, the kind of burst transmissions that came through in compressed packets and unpacked into something the bridge cared about. I didn't ask what she was monitoring. Lena's clearance was higher than mine, and she took the boundaries seriously. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. I saw her shoulders tighten, a small motion she probably didn't know she'd made, and her eyes tracked something on the right-hand display that I couldn't read from my angle. The data scrolled and stopped, scrolled again. Something? Routine traffic. She said it quickly, the way she said everything, but her jaw was set a little too tight. Fleet updates. Nothing for us. I waited a beat. Lena was pragmatic to the point of bluntness, and if she said it was nothing I had clearance to know about. I let it go. "I'm heading off to finish the conduit inspections. You want coffee later?" She glanced at me then, a quick, focused look that softened just slightly at the corners. "If the pot's fresh. Not drinking the stuff that's been sitting since midnight?" "I'll make a new one." "Then yes." She turned back to her console, and I left her to it. The exchange was typical. Lena and I had fallen into a friendship that didn't require much maintenance, the kind that survived on short conversations in corridors and the occasional shared meal in the mess. She was good at her job, better than most of the comms technicians I'd served with, and she carried the weight of the information she processed without letting it spill over into the rest of her. Most days, anyway. Today her shoulders had tightened at something on her screen, and I filed that away without dwelling on it. The war was out there. I knew that the way I knew the ship's hull was rated for a certain depth of vacuum, the way I knew the reactor could output more than we asked of it under normal operations. It was a fact, distant and abstract, something that happened in systems I didn't serve in and wouldn't see. The Covenant fleet was real, The colonies that had gone dark were real. But they were real the way a star's core temperature was real. A number in a report, a headline on a briefing I'd half listened to while thinking about a coolant pump that needed recalibrating. I returned to the aft section and knelt beside the last conduit junction on my list. The housing was warm under my hands, the metal carrying the steady 62 Hz vibration I'd checked twice already. I loosened the fasteners, pulled the panel, and ran the scanner one final time. The readout came back clean. Voltage steady. Thermal nominal. Insulation intact. I tightened the last fastener and sat back on my heels, listening to the ship. The hum was constant, a low thrum that ran through the deck plates and up into my knees, my spine, the base of my skull. It was the sound of everything working. It was the sound of a closed system running exactly the way it was designed to run. And as long as I could hear it, I knew I'd done my job. The ship was safe. We were safe. The math was simple, and I believed it. The number 2 coolant loop had been cycling unevenly all morning. A fractional wobble in the pressure readout that Vale had flagged at 0600 and that I'd been chasing through the manifolds for the better part of an hour. The hum of the ship was still there, the same 62 Hz I'd measured the day before. But something in the overtones had shifted. I couldn't name it. I told myself it was the coolant loop playing tricks on my ear, a harmonic I hadn't isolated yet, and I kept working. The engineering deck was quiet in the way it always was during mid-morning watch. A skeleton crew moved through the space with the easy rhythm of people who'd done the same tasks 100 times. Someone had left a half-empty coffee bulb on the edge of the main diagnostic console, and the liquid inside had long since gone cold, a faint skin forming on the surface. I noticed it because there was nothing else to notice. The ship was running, the readouts were green, the war was somewhere else. I had the manifold access panel open and was reaching for the pressure gauge when the comms unit above the main display crackled. It wasn't the usual tone. The usual tone was a soft chime, almost apologetic, the kind of sound that preceded a routine update or a shift change reminder. This was a hard break in the ambient noise, a sharp electronic snap that cut through the deck's quiet and made my hand stop halfway to the gauge. All hands, this is the captain. The voice was calm. That was the first thing I registered. Captain Jonah Thorne spoke the way someone might read a maintenance schedule, unembellished, and even as if the words he was about to say had been rehearsed so many times they'd lost whatever weight they once carried. I'd never heard his voice before. In 18 months aboard the Resolute Dawn, the captain had been an abstraction, a name on the ship's roster, a signature at the bottom of orders I never saw. Now he was in the air around me, and his tone made the hair on my forearms lift. Long-range sensors have detected an approaching Covenant fleet. Estimated contact in 40 minutes. All personnel to battle stations. This is not a drill. The word Covenant landed in the room and stayed there. For a long second, nobody moved. The coffee bulb sat where it had been. The pressure gauge hung half-connected in my hand. The coolant loop's readout kept cycling, a tiny amber number ticking up and down by fractions of a percent. And I stared at it because staring at it was easier than processing what the captain had just said. Then the klaxons hit. The sound was physical, a low pulse that started somewhere deep in the ship's emergency systems and built into a wail that I felt in my molars before I heard it in my ears. The lighting on the engineering deck shifted from standard white to a dull red that turned every shadow into something deeper and made the readouts glow with an urgency I'd never seen outside of a drill. Around me, the skeleton crew came alive all at once, chairs scraping back, boots hitting the deck plates in a sudden percussion of movement. "Mercer!" Vale's voice cut through the klaxon the way a blade cuts through noise. I turned and saw him already halfway across the deck, his weathered face set in an expression I'd never seen on him before. It wasn't fear. It was something older than fear, a kind of grim focus that looked like it had been waiting behind his eyes for years. "Battle Station 3, he said, not slowing down. "Now." I opened my mouth to say something. I don't know what. A question, maybe. A protest. The word covenant was still sitting in my chest like a stone I hadn't swallowed. But Vale was already past me, already reaching for the main power conduit panel on the far wall, already overriding the safety interlock with a series of keystrokes that bypassed 3 layers of authorization I'd been trained never to touch. "Sir, that interlock requires Lieutenant Commander Sato's clearance," I said. "Sato's on the bridge," Vale said, without looking up. "And we don't have 40 minutes to wait for protocol. Get to your station." The deck plates shuddered under my feet as the Resolute Dawn's reactor shifted from cruise output to combat readiness. I'd felt the ship change power states before, during drills. But this was different. This was faster. The hum I'd spent 18 months learning to trust was climbing into a register I didn't recognize, and the sound of it made my palms go slick against the wrench I was still holding. I dropped the wrench onto the diagnostic console and ran. Battle Station 3 was a secondary systems monitor tucked into the aft corner of the engineering deck. A cramped alcove with 3 display screens and a chair that had been bolted to the floor. So long ago, the bolts had rusted in place. I'd sat there a dozen times for drills, running through the same simulated scenarios Vale designed to keep us sharp. The scenarios had always felt abstract. Covenant ships on a screen, damage reports that reset when the drill ended, a score at the bottom that told me how many simulated casualties I'd prevented. This time, the screen showed real data, real sensor returns, real shapes moving through the black. I pulled up the tactical feed and felt my throat close. The Covenant fleet was a cluster of signatures I didn't have the training to interpret. But I didn't need training to understand the scale of it. There were too many. The computer was still counting them, still assigning designations, and the number in the corner of the screen kept ticking upward in a way that made me want to look away. "Daniel." Lena's voice came from my left, close enough that I flinched. She'd materialized at the adjacent station without me noticing, her short cropped hair catching the red emergency light in a way that made her look older than 29. Her gaze was fixed on her own screen, scanning lines of data I couldn't read, and her hands were moving across the console with a speed that was almost mechanical. "They're real," I said. It wasn't a question. "They're real." She didn't look at me. I picked up the encrypted traffic 6 minutes before the captain made the announcement. The long-range array caught them at the edge of the system. 13 ships, maybe more. The computer's still resolving the smaller signatures. 13 ships. I'd seen footage of what one Covenant ship could do to a human colony. I'd seen the after-action reports Vale kept in a locked file on his personal terminal, the ones he thought nobody knew about. 13 ships wasn't a raid. It was an extinction event. The Resolute Dawn can't fight 13 ships, I said. Lena's hands paused over the console. For a fraction of a second, her expression cracked, and I saw something underneath the focus. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the awareness of what fear would cost her if she let it in. "We're not alone," she said. "The captain's already sent a distress call. There's a battle group 2 systems over. If we can hold until they arrive..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The word "if" was doing all the work. The klaxon shifted pitch. A secondary alert layered over the first, and the ship's automated systems began cycling through a checklist I'd memorized months ago. Hull pressure seals engaging, point defense batteries coming online, reactor output climbing past the yellow line, and into a range I'd been told was only for emergencies. The deck plates vibrated with a new frequency, a high tremor that ran up through the soles of my boots and made my teeth ache. I pulled up the coolant loop diagnostics on my secondary screen. The number 2 loop was still wobbling, still showing that fractional instability I'd been chasing all morning. In another hour, I would have found it. I would have fixed it. I would have logged the repair and moved on to the next task, and the ship would have kept humming at 62 hertz, and the war would have stayed somewhere else. But I didn't have another hour. I had 40 minutes, and the number was already ticking down. "Daniel," Lena said again, and this time her voice was quieter. She was looking at me now, her sharp gaze holding mine across the narrow space between our stations. "Whatever happens, whatever we see in the next hour..." She stopped, swallowed. "You're not a cog. You know that, right?" I didn't answer. The captain's voice was still in my head, that flat professional tone that had delivered the end of everything I'd believed about this ship without a single wasted syllable. I'd felt nameless when he spoke. I'd felt like a component in a machine that was about to be tested to destruction. But Lena was looking at me like my name mattered. "I know," I said, and the lie sat between us, heavy and still. The tactical display updated. The Covenant signatures were closer now, resolving into distinct shapes the computer was beginning to classify. I didn't know the designations. I didn't want to know them. But I made myself look, because looking away wouldn't change what was coming. 38 minutes. The engineering deck had gone quiet again, but it wasn't the quiet of the mid-morning watch. It was the quiet of people who'd run out of things to say, who were checking their stations one last time and finding nothing left to fix. Vale was still at the power conduit panel, his calloused hands moving with a deliberation that looked almost calm. But I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. He'd done this before. I didn't know where or when, but I could see it in the way he moved, the way he'd overridden that interlock without hesitating. I turned back to my screen and pulled up the damage control protocols. The list was long. I started reading it from the top, memorizing the steps I'd only ever practiced in simulations, and tried not to think about what the ship would look like when those protocols stopped being theoretical. The hum of the Resolute Dawn climbed another half-step higher, and somewhere deep in the reactor, something I'd spent 18 months keeping stable began to strain against its limits. The first plasma bolt hit before I made it to the damage control locker. It wasn't a sound I had a word for. The deck kicked sideways, and the bulkhead to my left buckled inward with a shriek that went through my teeth, and I was on the floor. Before I understood I'd fallen, the emergency light stuttered, died, came back amber, The klaxon kept screaming, but it sounded farther away now, like it was happening to a different ship. Vale's voice cut through from somewhere ahead. "Mercer, on your feet. Breach near the primary conduits. Port side. Deck 4. Move." I pushed myself up. My shoulder had caught the edge of a conduit housing, and the arm didn't want to take weight, but it held. The deck was still shuddering, a low-frequency oscillation I could feel in my shins. Not the 62 hertz hum I'd spent 18 months learning to trust. Something deeper. Something wrong. Lena was already at the hatch when I got there, one hand braced against the frame, the other working the release. Her face was set in a way I hadn't seen before, all the usual sharp humor flattened into something harder. "Seals warped," she said. "Going to take both of us." I grabbed the lower handle and pulled. The hatch gave with a groan and a gust of air that smelled like an electrical fire and something else underneath. Something acrid that caught at the back of my throat. Coolant, maybe, or insulation cooking off a power line. The corridor beyond was worse. A section of overhead paneling had come down, and the deck was littered with shattered light fixtures and a spray of fasteners that crunched under my boots. Sparks rained from a severed cable bundle near the ceiling, throwing jagged shadows across the walls in time with the flicker of the emergency lights. "Through here," Vale called. He was already 20 meters ahead, half visible through a haze of smoke or vapor that hung in the passageway. "Breach is in the conduit access. We lose that trunk, we lose half the forward power grid." The ship lurched again. A different kind of impact this time, less a kick and more a long grinding shudder that made the deck plates sing. I grabbed a handhold and held on until it passed. Lena had done the same, her knuckles pale on the rung beside mine. We didn't look at each other. The conduit access was a narrow compartment off the main engineering trunk, lined with power relays and distribution nodes that fed everything forward of frame 47. The breach was a meter-wide rupture in the outer bulkhead, a wound that opened onto nothing. Emergency shutters had deployed, but the seal was incomplete, and I could hear the thin, high whistle of atmosphere bleeding through the gaps. "Patch kit," Vale said, pointing at a locker near the relay stack. "Ortiz, get me a damage read on the number 3 relay. If it's drawing current, I need to know before we seal anything conductive." I hauled the kit out and opened it. My hands were moving before I'd finished thinking about what came next, the steps lining up in my head the way they had in a dozen simulations. Sealant foam, reinforcing plates, a heat blanket to slow the thermal loss. I'd run this drill 6 times in my first year aboard and never once believed I'd use it. Lena had pulled a handheld scanner from her belt and was running it over the relay housing. "Current's down, but it's not dead. Residual draw on the tertiary line." "How much?" "Enough to arc if the foam hits it wet." Vale was already reaching past me. "Then we dry seal first, plates over the gap, blanket on top. Foam last, once I've killed the relay." He turned to the distribution panel and began throwing breakers without looking at the labels. He knew them by position. I pressed the first reinforcing plate against the breech. The metal was cold, and the pressure differential pulled at it, trying to suck it outward. I leaned my weight into it and felt the plate seat against the bulkhead with a dull clang. Lena was beside me a second later with the second plate, fitting it into the gap above mine without a word. I shifted left to give her room. She adjusted her angle to match. It wasn't something we'd practiced. It was just the only way the motion worked. The ship rolled hard to starboard. I felt the gravity plates lag, a half-second of lightness in my stomach before they compensated. Lena's shoulder knocked into mine, and she caught herself on the relay stack, her scanner clattering to the deck. "That one was close," she said. "Keep sealing." Vale's voice was flat, all business. He killed the last breaker, and the relay's status light went dark. "Foam it." I triggered the canister and worked the nozzle along the seam between the plates. The foam expanded on contact, a pale gray that darkened as it cured, filling the gaps where the shutters hadn't closed. The whistle of escaping atmosphere thinned, then stopped. Lena's comm unit crackled. She touched a hand to her earpiece, and I saw her jaw tighten. Whatever was coming through, it wasn't good. "Casualty report," she said after a moment. "Deck 2. Direct hit on the port battery. They're still counting." Vale didn't look up from the panel. "Seals holding?" I checked the pressure readout on the patch kit's gauge. "Holding. Partial integrity, maybe 60% of nominal, but it's not going to blow out." "Then we move. There'll be more." Another impact. Closer this time, a concussive slam that rang the deck like a bell. The lights went out entirely for 3 full seconds, and in the dark, I heard something structural groan, a long, low sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. When the amber came back, Vale was already at the hatch. "Power trunk on deck 3, he said. "If that one's compromised, the breach we just sealed won't matter. Mercer, you're with me. Ortiz, get back to comms and find out what's still shooting at us." Lena hesitated. Just a beat. Her eyes met mine, and something passed between us that didn't need words. An acknowledgement that the ship we'd both been living on for years had become a different place in the last 10 minutes. Then she nodded and was gone, her boots ringing on the deck plates as she headed aft. I followed Vale forward. The smoke was thicker here, and the heat from the damaged conduits pressed against my face like an open oven. Somewhere above us, the Resolute Dawn was absorbing fire from a Covenant fleet, and the only thing between the crew and the void was a series of patches and prayers and the reflexes of people who trained for a war they'd hoped never to see. Vale stopped at a junction and pointed at a safety interlock on the trunk access. "Bypass it. That interlock's there to prevent a cascade failure if the trunk's drawing over. Ah. I know what it's there for. If we wait for the safeties to cycle, we lose the trunk before we get the hatch open. Bypass it." I pulled the manual release tool from my belt and knelt beside the interlock. The override was simple, a mechanical disengage that let the hatch cycle without waiting for the system to confirm safe conditions. It was also a violation of about 6 different safety protocols. I triggered the release anyway. The hatch slid open, and the heat that rolled out made me flinch. The trunk was intact, strained, overheated, but intact. Vale was already inside, running his hands along the conduit casings like a doctor checking for broken bones. "We can reinforce this," he said. "Get me the thermal tape from the kit." I handed it to him. He worked fast, wrapping the stressed sections with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this longer than I'd been alive. I held the light and handed him tools, and tried not to think about what would happen if another plasma bolt hit while we were standing inside the main power trunk. The ship shuddered again, but it was a dying shudder. The kind that came after the worst had already passed. The impacts were spacing out. Either the fight was moving away from us, or we were drifting out of it. Vale finished the last wrap of tape and sat back on his heels. His face was streaked with soot and sweat, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that wasn't just focus. It was the look of a man who just watched something he'd spent 6 years maintaining get taken apart piece by piece. "That'll hold," he said. "Long enough." I didn't ask long enough for what. The emergency light steadied, and the klaxon cut out, replaced by the shipwide intercom. Captain Thorne's voice came through, calm and measured, in a way that felt almost obscene, given what I'd just seen. "Damage control teams report to your section chiefs. All non-essential personnel remain at battle stations. We are still under threat. I repeat, we are still under threat." Vale stood up and wiped his hands on his coveralls. "You did good, Mercer. Both of you." It was the first time he'd ever said anything like that to me. I didn't know what to do with it, so I just nodded and started packing up the kit. The deck beneath my feet was still vibrating, but the frequency had shifted again, settling into something that felt almost like the old hum. Almost. The difference was that now I knew what it sounded like when it stopped. The hatch to the medical bay was jammed open with a length of conduit, the metal still warm from whatever emergency had forced someone to wedge it there. I ducked through and stopped 2 steps inside, because the smell hit me before my eyes could make sense of what I was seeing. Blood has a smell. I'd never known that before. It's not just metallic, the way the training manuals describe it. It's thicker than that and warmer, and it coats the back of your throat in a way that makes you want to swallow and not swallow at the same time. The ventilation scrubbers were running at full capacity, and they weren't keeping up. The aid station had been set up in what used to be the junior officers' mess. The tables were still bolted to the deck, but now they held people instead of meal trays. 6 of them. No, 7. A corpsman I didn't recognize was working on someone near the far bulkhead, his gloves slick and dark, and another figure was bent over a supply crate, sorting bandages with the kind of focused, mechanical repetition that told me they'd been doing it for hours. "Mercer." The voice came from my left, and I turned to find a man in blood-spattered scrubs looking at me with the kind of exhaustion that had stopped being tired and become something structural. "You the tech they sent down?" "Yes, Daniel Mercer, engineering." "Bell, hospital corpsman." He didn't offer his hand, and I saw why. Both of his were gloved and wet. "You know how to run a dermal regenerator?" "I've read the specs." Reading's not running. He was already turning away, motioning for me to follow. "But it'll have to do. We've got 3 burn cases, and I've only got 2 hands. You're going to learn fast, or you're going to stand in the corner and stay out of the way. Understood?" "Understood." The first burn case was a Marine named Corrigan, according to the tag someone had taped to his collar. The skin on his left arm and shoulder was red and blistering in a pattern that traced the edge of his body armor, a clean line where the plasma had washed across him and the armor had stopped it. Where it hadn't stopped it, the skin was gone. I could see the glisten of subcutaneous tissue, the small white islands of what might have been fat. Bell handed me the regenerator. "Slow passes. Don't hover. You'll cook the healthy tissue." My hands were shaking. I could see them shaking. The regenerator was a standard UNSC field unit, a device I'd signed off on maintenance logs for a dozen times without ever holding one. The grip was textured rubber. The activation switch was under my thumb. All of these were facts I could hold on to. "Start at the perimeter," Bell said. "Work inward. The edges heal faster." I pressed the switch. The regenerator hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache, and the skin at the edge of the wound began to knit, pale pink crawling over the raw red. Corrigan didn't move. He was sedated, Bell told me, or I'd have been listening to him scream. "You're doing fine," Bell said, and the words were automatic, a thing he'd said 100 times to 100 different people. I didn't believe him, but I kept the regenerator moving. The comm panel near the hatch crackled, and Lieutenant Commander Sato's voice came through, calm and steady in the way that bridge officers were trained to be. "Chief Vale, this is Sato. Navigation's reporting critical damage to the primary guidance array. We've lost long-range vector calculation. Return to UNSC controlled space is not currently viable. Repeat, return is not viable." I looked up from the regenerator. Bell had stopped sorting bandages. His face didn't change, but his hands went still on the crate, and that was worse than any expression he could have made. "Understood, Commander," Vale's voice replied, and then Sato was speaking again, her tone flattening further, the way voices do when the words themselves are too heavy to carry any inflection. "Additional report. The colony evacuation is failing. Covenant ground forces have overrun the primary extraction zone. Civilian transports are taking fire. We are receiving distress signals, but are unable to render assistance at this time." The regenerator was still humming in my hand. I made myself look back down at Corrigan's arm, at the skin closing, at the work I could do, because it was the only work in front of me. The ship wasn't going home. The colony wasn't being saved. I kept the regenerator moving. Bell resumed sorting bandages. His motions were slower now, less mechanical. She said, "At this time." I heard it. That's not a no. I didn't answer. We both knew what "at this time" meant. The hatch scraped against the conduit, and Chief Vale stepped through. He was still in his engineering coveralls, the right sleeve torn at the shoulder, and his face was set in the same expression he wore during a reactor scram, controlled, unreadable. But he was holding his right arm close to his body, the elbow tucked in, and when he moved past the first row of tables, I saw the way his weight shifted, favoring his left side, protecting something. "Chief?" Bell straightened, his eyes tracking Vale's posture, the way I'd seen Vale track a pressure readout. "You're bleeding." Vale glanced down at his side, where a dark stain was spreading through the fabric of his coveralls. The blood looked black under the emergency lighting. "It's superficial." "Let me take a look." "You've got patience." "You're standing in my aid station. That makes you a patient." Vale didn't move. For a long moment, the two of them just looked at each other, Bell with his blood-wet gloves, and Vale with his stoic mask, and the stain getting wider. I could see the exact shape of the lie on Vale's face, the way he was holding it in place by force of will. "I came to check on the power draw," Vale said. "Medical's pulling from the secondary grid, and I need to know if it's stable." "The power's stable," Bell said. "Your blood pressure isn't. Sit down, Chief." "Not now." Vale turned toward the hatch, and the motion cost him. I saw it. The brief hesitation, the way his jaw tightened, the careful breath he took before he moved again. He was hurt. He was hurt, and he was refusing care, and there was nothing I could do about either of those things. "Chief," I said, and he paused with his hand on the hatch frame. I didn't know what I was going to say next. I just knew I didn't want him to walk out. "Finish your work, Mercer." He didn't look back. "Bell needs the help." Then he was gone, and the hatch scraped shut behind him, and Bell was staring at the empty doorway with an expression that was equal parts frustration and something quieter, something that looked a lot like fear. "He's been like that since the first impact," Bell said. "Won't let anyone touch him." I looked down at the regenerator in my hand, at Corrigan's arm, at the new skin that was pale and fragile and not yet strong. The ship's vibration had shifted again, a low-frequency thrum that felt wrong in my bones, and somewhere deeper in the aid station, a wounded crew member moaned in a voice that didn't sound entirely human. "He's the chief," I said. "He doesn't know how to stop." Bell picked up a fresh roll of bandages and didn't answer. I turned back to my patient and kept the regenerator moving, slow passes, working inward, because that was the only thing I knew how to do. The hatch to the conduit access tunnel was already open when I reached it. The locking bolts sheared clean through. Someone had been here before me, probably a damage control team running an initial survey, but the repair order on my datapad was fresh. The air inside carried a sharp, metallic taste that coated the back of my tongue, and the emergency lighting strips along the ceiling flickered in a rhythm that didn't match the ship's normal power cycle. I ducked through the opening and stepped over a collapsed section of wall plating. The deck grating bowed upward where something heavy had landed. The tunnel ran fore to aft along the port side, just inboard of the main armor belt, and it housed 3 of the primary power distribution conduits that fed the aft maneuvering thrusters. According to the damage report, Conduit 2 had taken a near miss from a plasma bolt and was showing intermittent voltage drop across 3 junction points. The smell got worse the farther in I went. Not just ozone. Something organic had burned in here, insulation maybe, or the coating on the conduit housing. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and swept the beam along the overhead cable trays. The shadows jumped and settled, jumped again with each flicker of the emergency lights. "Mercer to engineering," I said, keying my comm. "I'm at the port conduit tunnel, frame 31. The access hatch is compromised, and I'm seeing structural deformation in the overhead trays. Beginning assessment now." "Copy, Mercer." The voice on the other end wasn't Vale, one of the second shift techs, someone I didn't know well. "We're tracking your suit transponder. Report when you've got a damage estimate." I clipped the flashlight to my shoulder mount and pulled myself up onto a maintenance platform that gave me a clearer view of the conduit run. The housing on number 2 was scorched black along a 3-foot section, and the inspection port had warped outward like a blister ready to pop. I ran my gloved hand along the surface, feeling for heat, and found it warm but not dangerous. The real problem would be inside. Another impact rolled through the hull, a low-frequency tremor that traveled up through the deck, grating and into my knees. I braced against the conduit housing until it passed. The ship had been taking hits like that every few minutes since the engagement started, and each one felt closer than the last. The Covenant fleet was still out there. 13 ships according to the last tactical update I'd heard, and we were running on borrowed time. I unsealed the inspection port, and the pressure differential hissed past my faceplate. A thin stream of vapor that smelled like an electrical fire in a closed room. Inside, the primary bus bar was intact, but two of the secondary feeds had melted through their insulation and were arcing intermittently against the grounded housing. Every few seconds, a blue-white spark jumped the gap, and the overhead lights dimmed in response. "Found it," I muttered, and reached for my kit. The repair was delicate work. I had to cut power to the affected feeds without dropping the whole conduit, then splice in replacement sections from the spares I'd brought. All while, the ship kept taking fire and the deck kept shifting under my boots. I worked with my jaw tight and my shoulders hunched, forcing my hands to stay slow and precise when every instinct wanted speed. A bad splice here would cascade into a full conduit failure, and a full conduit failure would cost us the aft thrusters. Without those, we couldn't maneuver. Without maneuver, we were dead. The first splice took 7 minutes. The second took longer because the housing was deformed, and I had to file down the replacement section to get it to seat properly. Sweat ran down my temples and into my collar, and I blinked it out of my eyes without looking up from the work. I was tightening the last clamp when Captain Thorne's voice cut through the comm channel, overriding every other signal on the net. "All hands, this is the captain." His voice was different from the last time I'd heard it over shipwide. The earlier announcements had been clipped and professional, the voice of a man managing a tactical problem. This one had something else in it. A pause before the next word that told me I didn't want to hear what came after. "The colony evacuation has failed. Covenant ground forces have overrun the extraction zone. There are no more transports leaving the surface." My hands stopped moving. The wrench stayed where it was, half turned on the clamp bolt, and I stared at the conduit housing without seeing it. "I have ordered all remaining UNSC assets in the area to disengage and withdraw. The Resolute Dawn will execute an emergency slipspace jump in 4 minutes. All personnel secure for jump immediately. Repeat, secure for jump immediately." The channel went quiet. The emergency lights kept flickering. The conduit kept arcing, a small blue spark jumping the gap every few seconds, and I watched it happen 3 times before I made myself start breathing again. The colony was gone. Everyone still on the surface was gone. We'd come here to pull them out, and we'd failed, and now we were running, and the only thing between us and the same fate was 4 minutes and a slipspace drive that hadn't been tested under combat load since the ship left dry dock. I finished the clamp. My hands moved through the motions without any conscious decision on my part, muscle memory taking over, while the rest of me was still processing the captain's words. I sealed the inspection port, dogged the fasteners down, and ran a quick continuity check on the repaired feeds. The readout showed green across all 3 junctions. "Engineering Mercer, Conduit 2 is stabilized. Aft thrusters should have full power." "Copy, Mercer. Get clear of that tunnel. Jump in 3 minutes." I dropped down from the platform and started back toward the hatch, picking my way over the collapsed plating and the buckled grating. The ship groaned around me, a long, low sound that ran through the bulkheads like a note held too long on a cello. I'd heard the Resolute Dawn make plenty of noises in my 18 months aboard, but this one was new. This one sounded like the ship knew what was coming. I was 10 feet from the hatch when I saw Chief Vale. He was standing just inside the access tunnel, one hand braced against the bulkhead, his face gray under the emergency lights. He had a datapad in his other hand, and he was reading something on it with the kind of focus that meant he was ignoring something else. Pain, probably. the injury Bell and I had seen in the aid station. He was still bleeding under that uniform, still refusing treatment. And now he was down here checking on conduit repairs instead of lying on a cot where he belonged. "Chief," he looked up. "Mercer. Conduit status?" "Stable. 2 secondary feeds were arcing. I spliced in replacements. It'll hold." "Good." He lowered the data pad, and his gaze moved past me, down the tunnel toward the repaired section. "Get to your jump station. I'll verify the work." "You need to get to medical." "I need to verify the work." I opened my mouth to argue, and the ship hit me with another impact. Harder than the last one, hard enough that I stumbled and had to catch myself on the hatch frame. Vale didn't move. He just stood there with his hand on the bulkhead and waited for the tremor to pass. 2 minutes to jump, the comm announced. "All personnel secure immediately." "Go," Vale said. "That's an order." I went. My jump station was a small compartment 2 decks up, just aft of the main engineering spaces. I made it there with 90 seconds to spare and strapped myself into the acceleration couch, my hands finding the restraints by feel, while my mind was still back in the conduit tunnel, still hearing the captain's voice. "The colony evacuation has failed. No more transports. We're running." The Slipspace drive began its spin-up sequence. I felt it through the deck plates, a rising vibration that started low in my spine and climbed until my teeth ached. The lights dimmed to emergency red, and the ventilation fans cycled down, every non-essential system shedding power to feed the drive. The ship was holding its breath. I thought about Lena Ortiz, somewhere up on the bridge or in the communications section, strapped into her own couch and watching the countdown. I thought about Bell in the aid station, still working on Corrigan or whoever had come in after I left. I thought about Vale, still standing in that access tunnel with a wound he wouldn't let anyone treat, verifying my work because that was what he did. That was who he was. And if the jump went wrong, he would die down there in the dark with a data pad in his hand. The countdown reached 0. The Resolute Dawn jumped. It wasn't like the training sims. The sims gave you a smooth transition, a brief disorientation, and then the steady hum of Slipspace. This was violent. The ship wrenched sideways, a force that pulled against the restraints and slammed my head back into the couch. The lights cut out entirely, and the emergency strips didn't come on. In the dark, the hull screamed, a sound I'd never heard before and never wanted to hear again. Metal stressed past its tolerances and holding together by sheer luck. I counted seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. The screaming didn't stop. 5, 6. Something popped in the compartment above me, a sharp crack like a weld failing. 7, 8. The violence stopped as suddenly as it had started. The lights came back on, dim and red, and the ventilation fans spun up again with a hesitant whine. The ship was still around me. I was still breathing. My hands were locked around the restraint straps, and I had to concentrate to make them let go. We were in Slipspace. We'd made the jump. But the ship felt different now. The vibration through the deck plates, irregular in a way that spoke to damage I couldn't see from inside an acceleration couch. And we had no idea where we were going. The primary guidance array was still down. Sato had confirmed that hours ago. We jumped blind. The comm crackled. Captain Thorne's voice came through again, and this time the strain was unmistakable. The words pushed out, past something that wanted to keep them in. "All hands, this is the captain. We have successfully entered Slipspace. Damage control teams report to your stations for immediate assessment. I will address the crew once we have a clearer picture of our situation." A pause. The channel stayed open a beat too long. "We're still here. That counts for something." The channel closed. I unstrapped from the couch and stood up on legs that didn't feel entirely like my own. The deck was steady under my boots, or steady enough, and the emergency lights gave me enough to see by. I found my kit where I'd stowed it and checked the charge on my flashlight. There would be new damage to assess, new repairs to make. The ship was still flying, and that meant my job wasn't done. And for now, in the red-lit quiet after the jump, that was enough to keep me moving. The engineering deck didn't sound right. I'd worked that space for 18 months, and I knew its voice the way I knew the cadence of Vale's morning checks, or the particular rattle the portside conduit housing made when the coolant pressure dipped. What I heard now was none of those things. The Slipspace jump had torn something loose in the ship's throat, and the groan coming through the bulkheads was a sound I'd never heard before, low and irregular, like a bearing spinning dry inside a housing that was about to seize. Emergency lighting washed the deck in flat red. Half the consoles were dark. The other half scrolled error codes faster than I could read them. Amber text crawling across screens that should have been showing pressure gradients and thermal profiles. I pulled myself into the primary diagnostic station and started killing alarms, working through the cascade one failure at a time. "Talk to me." Lena's voice came from behind me, short and clipped, the way she sounded when she was already bracing for bad news. "Navigation's gone. Long-range comms are dead. Auxiliary power is cycling on a fail-safe loop that's going to burn itself out if I don't isolate it." I didn't look up. My fingers moved across the console, pulling up subsystem schematics, flagging the worst of the damage. Primary guidance array is still offline from the earlier hit. We jumped blind and we came out blind. Lena stepped up beside me and leaned over the secondary display. Her short cropped hair was matted with sweat, and there was a smear of something dark across her jaw. She didn't seem to notice. "Short-range comms are barely functional. I'm getting carrier wave, but no signal lock. It's like screaming into a canyon and waiting to hear if anyone screams back." "Can you boost it?" "I can try. But Daniel..." She stopped, and I heard something in the pause that made me turn. Her face was hard to read in the red light, but her hands were still on the console, not moving. "I don't know where we are. The star charts aren't matching anything in the nav database. We are not in charted space." I turned back to my screen. The damage report was still populating, new failures cascading down the list as the ship's diagnostic routines worked through the wreckage of the jump. Hull integrity was holding, barely. Reactor output was stable but degraded. Life support was drawing from emergency reserves, and the list kept going. "We knew the jump was blind," I said. "Sato said the guidance array was shot before we went in." "Knowing it and seeing it are different things." Lena's voice had gone quieter. "I've spent 6 years listening to fleet traffic. There's always something, a distress beacon, a navigation buoy, a patrol chatter. There's always something." She tapped the comms display, where the carrier wave scrolled in a flat, unbroken line. "There's nothing out there, just us." The hatch at the far end of the deck cycled open, and Vale came through. He moved the way he always moved, deliberate and unhurried. But I noticed the way his right arm stayed pressed against his side, the elbow tucked in tight, like he was guarding something. His face was the same weathered mask it had been in the aid station, giving nothing away. "Status," he said, not a question. "Navigation dead, long-range comms dead, auxiliary power unstable, guidance array still offline from the pre-jump damage." I read the list without inflection. "Short-range comms are up, but not locked. We're running on emergency power and we don't know where we are." Vale nodded once, like I'd confirmed something he already expected. "Sato's ordered an emergency beacon transmission. Weak signal, low power draw. It's all we can sustain right now." He moved to the main power distribution panel and began cycling through the load priorities. His movements were precise, but I watched his right hand linger on the panel edge a half-second longer than it needed to, bracing weight his legs should have been carrying. "Mercer, you're on reactor stability. I want the auxiliary loop isolated before it takes down the primary. Ortiz, get the beacon programmed and transmitting. I don't care if the signal's weak. I care that it's consistent." "Consistent might not be enough," Lena said. "If we're outside the network, a weak beacon could take weeks to reach anyone. Months." "Then we'd better hope someone's listening." Vale didn't look at her when he said it. His attention stayed on the power readouts. But his voice had an edge I recognized, the one he used when he was telling you to stop talking and start working. I pulled the reactor stability schematics onto my screen and started tracing the auxiliary loop. The failsafe had kicked in during the jump, some kind of surge that the regulators hadn't caught, and now the loop was cycling power back into a closed circuit that was overheating the secondary relays. If I didn't isolate it, the thermal buildup would trip the primary safeties, and then we'd lose the reactor entirely. The work was familiar. Trace the circuit, find the break, reroute. It was the same thing I'd been doing since I came aboard, the same rhythm that had kept me steady through 18 months of routine maintenance and minor repairs. But my hands were slower now, and I kept having to reread the same lines of data, the numbers blurring into each other until I blinked hard and forced them back into focus. "Daniel," Lena's voice cut through the noise of the alarms I'd stopped hearing. "The beacon's programmed. I'm transmitting now." I looked up. On her display, a single indicator pulsed at half-second intervals, a green dot against the black of the comms interface. It was a small thing, barely a whisper of signal strength, and somewhere out in the dark beyond the hull, it was spreading outward at light speed, a ripple in an ocean that might be empty. "How long until we know if anyone hears it?" I asked. Lena didn't answer right away. She watched the pulse for a moment, her jaw set, and when she spoke, her voice was steady in a way that sounded like it cost her something. "We don't. We just keep transmitting and wait." The deck groaned again, a long, low sound that ran through the alloy casing of the portside conduit and vibrated up through the soles of my boots. I felt it in my teeth. The ship was holding together, but it was telling us what it cost. Every stressed weld and overworked circuit singing its own note of strain. "Mercer," Vale's voice came from behind me, closer than I expected. "The auxiliary loop?" "I'm on it." "Be faster." I found the isolation valve in the schematic and routed the command through the secondary control bus. The readout flickered, recalibrated, and then steadied as the auxiliary loop dropped offline. The thermal warning on the secondary relays went amber, then green. One less thing trying to kill us. Vale was still standing behind me. I could hear his breathing, a little too controlled, a little too deliberate. When I turned, he was watching my screen with an expression I couldn't read, his left hand resting on the back of my chair, his right still pressed against his side. "Good," he said. "Now check the coolant pressure on loop 2. The jump probably threw the regulators out of calibration." I nodded and turned back to the console. Behind me, I heard Lena's station chirp as the beacon cycled through another transmission burst, the green dot pulsing steady and small and alone. The red emergency lights washed everything in the same flat color, and the ship kept groaning, and somewhere beyond the hull there was nothing but silence and distance, and the faint, fragile signal we were throwing out into the dark, like a message in a bottle. I pulled up the coolant pressure readouts and got back to work. The auxiliary power junction at frame 31 hadn't been designed for access by someone who'd been awake for 26 hours. The panel came off with 3 turns of a hex bolt. Same as it always did, but my hands felt like they belonged to someone else. I set the bolts on the deck plate in a neat line, left to right, because if I didn't, I'd lose one, and then I'd spend 10 minutes crawling around on my hands and knees looking for it while the beacon stayed dark. The engineering deck had stopped sounding wrong somewhere around 0300. Now it just sounded broken in ways I'd catalogued and prioritized and mostly couldn't fix. The primary coolant loop was running at 61% capacity. The number 3 thrust bearing had developed a vibration I didn't like and couldn't do anything about. The emergency lighting had stopped flickering an hour ago and settled into a steady amber that was almost worse, because steady meant permanent, and permanent meant we weren't getting main power back anytime soon. I pulled the junction's diagnostic lead and plugged it into my datapad. The readout scrolled for 3 seconds before it gave me what I already knew. The auxiliary line to the communications array was dead, and the reroute through frame 31 was the only path left that hadn't been slagged by the plasma hit or the jump, or whatever combination of the two had turned half the port side conduit runs into fused scrap. "Talk to me, Mercer." Lena's voice came from somewhere behind my left shoulder. I didn't turn around. I was looking at the impedance reading on the datapad and trying to decide if the number meant a physical break in the line or just a coupling that had worked loose during the jump. "I'm looking at a 3000 ohm spike on the auxiliary feed," I said, "which either means the line severed at frame 33 or the couplings backed off far enough to arc. I won't know until I get the next panel open. And if it's severed? Then I run a bypass through the maintenance trunk and we lose another 4 hours." I finally looked up. Lena was standing in the hatchway with a datapad tucked under one arm and the expression I'd learned to read over 18 months of shared watches. She'd heard something she wasn't going to tell me unless I asked. "What did you pick up?" She shifted her weight. The red emergency lighting caught the edge of her jaw and the short crop of her hair and made her look older than 29. Encrypted burst, covenant frequencies, could be a relay drone, could be a scout, could be debris pinging on a dead channel. She paused. "Sato's running it through the signal processor now." I turned back to the junction. My hands found the hex driver without me having to look for it. "How long ago?" 20 minutes. I would have told you sooner, but you were 3 decks down working on the coolant manifold." "Right." I fitted the driver to the next bolt and started turning. "Tell Sato I'll have the auxiliary feed to the array prepped in 2 hours. Maybe less if the coupling's just loose." 2 hours. She said it like she was writing it down in her head, which she probably was. Lena had spent 6 years listening to fleet traffic, and she'd learned to hold numbers the way other people held grudges. I'll let her know. She didn't leave. I got the second bolt out and set it beside the first and waited. The medical base sent up updated casualty figures, she said finally. 41 confirmed, 12 more critical. I didn't stop working. The third bolt was seized, and I had to put my shoulder into it. Anyone we know? Nguyen, from damage control. I'd played cards with Nguyen 3 weeks ago in the enlisted mess. He'd owed me 12 credits, and he'd laughed every time he lost a hand, which was often because he couldn't bluff to save his life. I filed the name somewhere I wouldn't have to look at it, and kept turning the bolt. And Vale? I asked. What about him? I didn't answer right away. The bolt came free, and I added it to the line. 4 bolts, neat and straight. Nothing. Just asking. Lena didn't push. She tapped her datapad against her palm once, a habit she had when she was thinking about something she wasn't going to say. And then she turned and walked back toward the comm station. Her footsteps faded into the constant low-frequency drone of the ship's struggling systems. And I was alone with the junction and the impedance reading, and the thought of Chief Vale moving stiff and slow through the engineering deck with a manual open on a console he wasn't really reading. I'd seen him at 0200, leaning against a bulkhead near the reactor monitoring station. His hands had been shaking. Just a tremor, the kind anyone might have after too many hours without sleep. But he'd caught me looking and straightened up too fast, and the wince had flickered across his face before he could stop it. He'd said something about the coolant pressure and walked away, and I'd watched him go and noticed that he was favoring his left side and trying not to. The 4th bolt went into my pocket so I wouldn't lose it. I pulled the panel free and shone my light into the conduit run. The coupling at frame 33 was intact. The line wasn't severed. I let out a breath I hadn't noticed I'd been holding and reached for the torque wrench. Mercer. Lieutenant Commander Sato's voice came through the comms speaker, mounted above the junction access, calm and clipped, and carrying the particular weight of someone who'd been making hard decisions for too many hours. I didn't salute because I was halfway into a conduit run with a wrench in one hand and a light in the other, but I straightened up as much as the space allowed. Ma'am? Status on the auxiliary feed. Coupling's intact. I'm tightening it now. I can have power to the array in 90 minutes. Good. A pause. When you're done there, report to the port conduit tunnel at frame 31. We've got a secondary power line that took damage during the jump, and it needs to be replaced before the array can draw a stable load. I closed my eyes for a moment. Frame 31 was 3 decks down and on the other side of the ship. The secondary power line ran through a conduit tunnel that was barely wide enough for a man to turn around in, and replacing a damaged section meant pulling 50 feet of armored cable through a space that would be dark and hot and filled with the sharp edges of whatever had broken loose during the jump. Understood, I said. I'll be there as soon as the coupling's torqued. Sato out. The speaker went silent. I opened my eyes and looked at the coupling and started tightening it, quarter turn by quarter turn, feeling each thread engage with the familiar resistance of metal that wanted to stay where it was. The torque wrench clicked when it hit the specified value, and I checked it twice before I pulled back and reached for the next panel. I was fitting the bolts back into the junction housing when I heard footsteps behind me again, heavier than Lena's, slower. "How's that coupling?" Chief Vale's voice was rougher than it had been 12 hours ago. I didn't turn around. I kept threading the bolt and said, "Torqued to spec. Line's intact. I'm about to head down to frame 31 and start on the secondary." "Good." He moved into my peripheral vision and stopped beside the open junction. His left hand was pressed flat against the bulkhead, not casual, the way someone leans when they're tired, but deliberate, the way someone braces when they're not sure their legs will hold. His face was the color of old paper. "Sato tell you about the Covenant signal?" Lena did. I finished the last bolt and stood up. "Could be nothing." "Could be." He didn't sound like he believed it. "You got everything you need for the cable pull?" "I'll manage." Vale nodded. The motion was stiff, almost mechanical, and when he pushed off the bulkhead to turn away, his right hand went to his side for just a moment before he caught himself and let it drop. It was a small thing, a half-second gesture that anyone else might have missed. But I'd been watching him for 18 months, and I'd learned to read the difference between a chief who was tired and a chief who was hurt. "Chief," I said. He stopped. I didn't know what I was going to say next. I stood there with the hex driver in my hand and the emergency lights washing everything amber and the ship groaning around us like something wounded and alive. And I thought about Nguyen who couldn't bluff, and the 41 names on the medical base list, and the Covenant signal that might be a drone or might be a scout or might be the first warning of something worse. I thought about the beacon that was still dark, and the cable that needed pulling, and the 90 minutes of work between now and the moment the array could finally transmit. "I'll handle frame 31, I said. "You should get some rack time." Vale turned his head just enough to look at me. His eyes were tired, and something else, something I couldn't name, and for a second I thought he was going to argue. Then he nodded once, a short jerk of his chin, and walked toward the hatch without saying anything else. His footsteps were uneven. I listened to them fade down the corridor and tried not to count the places where the rhythm stuttered. I picked up my toolkit and started toward the access ladder that led down to frame 31. The ship kept groaning. The emergency lights stayed amber. Somewhere above me, Lena was listening to frequencies full of static and silence and the faint possibility of something hostile. And somewhere below me, 50 feet of armored cable was waiting in a dark tunnel that smelled of scorched insulation and burnt copper. I climbed down the ladder and got to work. The communications array sat in a dedicated compartment 2 decks above the main engineering spaces, accessible only through a vertical access shaft that had taken me 40 minutes to climb, with a toolkit slung across my back. The rungs were slick with condensation. Every third one had a vibration that traveled up through my palms and into my wrists, a frequency I didn't recognize from the ship I'd spent 18 months learning by feel. The compartment itself was cold enough that I could see my breath. Emergency lighting ran in thin strips along the bulkhead seams, casting everything in a dim sepia that made the shadows look deeper than they were. The main console was dead, its surface a flat gray that reflected nothing. I set the toolkit down on the deck plate and let the ache in my shoulders settle into something I could work through. "Mercer." Lena's voice came from the hatch behind me, slightly breathless from the climb. You made it. Mostly. I knelt beside the console access panel and worked the release bolts free. The metal was cold enough to bite through my gloves. How long have you been waiting? 2 hours. Sato sent me up as soon as the auxiliary loop showed stable. She moved to the secondary station against the port bulkhead, her boots quiet on the deck. I've been running diagnostics on a tablet. The array itself isn't damaged. It's the power routing. Whatever took out frame 31 took the feed line with it. I pulled the access panel free and set it aside. Inside, the relay board was a mess of scorched contacts and one capacitor that had burst open like a spent cartridge. The smell of burnt copper was thick enough to coat the back of my throat. I can bypass the main relay, I said. Run a jumper from the auxiliary bus directly into the array's amplifier stage. It won't be clean power, but it'll be enough to get the transmitter warm. Define not clean. Voltage ripple, maybe 12%. The signal will have some noise on it. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then, noise I can work with. Dead silence, I can't. I pulled the jumper kit from the toolkit and started tracing the bus bar with my finger, mapping the route in my head. The auxiliary power junction I'd repaired at frame 31 was feeding this compartment through a trunk line that ran up the port side of the ship. Somewhere between there and here, the line had taken damage that the diagnostic panel hadn't caught. I could hear the faint whine of a transformer struggling under load somewhere behind the bulkhead. Give me 30 minutes, I said. You have 20 before the battery reserve on my tablet runs out, and I'm working from memory. I didn't answer. I was already cutting the damaged relay free, the wire snips cold in my hand. The work settled into a rhythm. Strip the insulation, crimp the jumper lead, route it around the dead capacitor and into the amplifier's input stage. My hands knew the motions, even if my eyes kept losing focus, the fatigue from the past 3 days pooling at the edges of my vision. I blinked it back and kept going. The transformer whine changed pitch when I connected the second jumper, dropping from a complaint to something steadier. That's the bus stabilizing, I said. Another 5 minutes, and I'll have the amplifier stage powered. Lena didn't respond. When I glanced over, she was staring at her tablet, her jaw tight. Her fingers were still on the screen, but they weren't moving. Ortiz. I heard you. She looked up. In the thin emergency lighting, her face was all angles and shadow. I was just thinking about the last time I sent a transmission. It was a routine fleet update, encrypted burst, scheduled for 1400. I didn't even look at the content before I sent it. Just pushed the button and went back to monitoring traffic. What was in it? I don't remember. She set the tablet down on the console. I've spent 6 years listening to fleet traffic, Mercer. 6 years of encrypted bursts and status reports and casualty lists. And the one transmission that matters, the one that might actually get someone to come looking for us, is going to be a weak signal beacon running off a patched power line in uncharted space. I tightened the last jumper connection and sat back on my heels. It's not about the transmission, it's about someone being in a position to hear it. That's what I'm afraid of. I reached up and closed the amplifier stage's circuit breaker. The console flickered once, twice, and then the display stabilized, a wash of pale blue text scrolling across the screen. The compartment filled with the drone of cooling fans spinning up and the deeper resonance of the transmitter warming from standby to active. A green status light blinked on the main panel, steady and regular. Power's good, I said. "She's all yours." Lena moved to the console, and her fingers found the controls without hesitation. I watched her configure the beacon parameters, her hands precise and quick. The same economy of motion I'd seen in Vale when he was running a damage control drill. She set the frequency, the burst interval, the message loop. Every few seconds, she paused to check a reading, her gaze flicking across the display, and then her hands resumed their motion. "Beacon is configured," she said. "Low power intermittent transmission, 30-second burst every 4 minutes. The message contains our ship identifier, last known position before the jump, and a request for assistance." She paused. "I'm keeping it short. Less data means less chance of corruption." "When do you start transmitting?" She looked at me then, and something in her expression shifted. It wasn't hope exactly. It was closer to resolve, the kind that comes after you've decided there's no point waiting for a better option. "Now," she said, and pressed the transmit key. The first pulse went out. I couldn't hear it, couldn't feel it, but I saw the indicator on the console cycle from standby to transmit and back again. A single green flash. Then the compartment was quiet, except for the cooling fans and the low drone of the amplifier. "That's it," Lena said. "One pulse. In 4 minutes, another one. And 4 minutes after that, another." She let her hands drop from the console. "It's not much." "It's more than we had an hour ago." The hatch at the far end of the compartment cycled open. I turned, expecting Sato or one of the damage control team, but it was Vale. He was moving slowly, one hand braced against the bulkhead, his face gray beneath the stubble. His uniform was rumpled, and I could see the edge of a bandage beneath his jacket, a thick white line pressed against his ribs. "Chief." I was on my feet before I realized I'd moved. "You shouldn't be climbing access shafts." "I didn't climb. I took the long way around." His voice was thin, the words spaced out like he was rationing them. "Wanted to see if the array was online." "It's online," Lena said. "Beacon's transmitting." Vale nodded. He took another step into the compartment, and his knee buckled. He caught himself on the edge of a console, his knuckles going pale, and then he let himself slide down until he was sitting on the deck with his back against the bulkhead. "Chief." I crossed the compartment and knelt beside him. His breathing was shallow and too fast. The bandage under his jacket had a dark spot on it, small but fresh. "You're bleeding again." "I'm aware." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Bell's on his way." Ortiz called him. I looked at Lena. She was already speaking into the comm panel, her voice low and urgent. When she caught my gaze, she nodded once. "You should have stayed in the medical bay," I said. The medical bay is a supply closet with a cot in it. Vale opened his eyes. And I needed to see this. He tilted his head toward the console, toward the green status light blinking its steady rhythm. The beacon. I needed to know it was working. "It's working. Good." He let his head rest against the bulkhead. The tension in his shoulders eased just a fraction. "That's good." The hatch cycled again, and Bell came through it, a medical kit in one hand and a portable scanner in the other. He didn't say anything. He just knelt beside Vale, pulled the jacket aside, and started cutting the bandage free. His hands were steady, his face unreadable. I'd seen him work before, during the battle, but this was different. This wasn't triage in the middle of chaos. This was careful, deliberate, the kind of attention you give when you have time to do it right. "You let this go too long, Chief," Bell said, his voice quiet. The wound's infected. I can treat it here, but you're not walking out of this compartment under your own power. Vale didn't argue. He just nodded, his eyes on the console, on the green light that kept blinking its steady pulse every 4 minutes. I stood up and moved back to the console. Lena was watching me, her hands resting on the controls. Behind her, the display showed the beacon's transmission log. One burst sent, the next one queued. A small, fragile thread of data, reaching out into the dark. How long can we keep transmitting? I asked. The auxiliary power loop will hold as long as the reactor does, she said. Days, weeks, maybe, if we manage the draw carefully. And if someone's listening? Then they'll hear us. She looked at the display, then back at me. It's not a guarantee, Mercer. You know that. I know. The compartment was cold, and the lights were dim, and somewhere below us, the ship was still groaning, the bulkheads settling into damage that hadn't finished shifting. But the beacon was transmitting. Vale was finally letting Bell do his job, and Lena was standing at the console with her hand on the transmit key, ready for the next pulse. I picked up my toolkit and started checking the power conduits, tracing each line from the junction box to the amplifier, looking for any sign of strain or overload. The ship's fragility was a constant presence, a fact I couldn't ignore. But for now, the connections held. The voltage stayed steady. The green light kept blinking. Lena's hand moved on the console, and the second pulse went out. I didn't sleep. Not really. The bunk in the crew quarters was a narrow shelf of foam and regulation bedding that had absorbed the smell of coolant and sweat over the 18 months I'd been aboard, and lying on it with my eyes closed felt more like a simulation of rest than the thing itself. My body had stopped asking permission hours ago. It just lay there, a collection of aches I'd stopped cataloging, while my mind turned over the same few facts like a wrench in a bolt that wouldn't catch. The emergency lights in the compartment had been dimmed to a low golden wash, the kind that made every surface look bruised. Someone had rigged a privacy curtain across the open end of the bunk row, using a thermal blanket and 3 magnetic clips. It swayed when the ventilation cycled, a soft whisper of fabric against the deck plate. I watched it move, counted the cycles. 4 breaths, then the fan would kick, then the blanket would drift. 4 breaths. Fan. Drift. The rhythm had replaced the 62 Hz hum I used to track without thinking, the one that meant the reactor was running clean and the ship was whole. That frequency had shifted after the jump. I hadn't measured the new one yet. I wasn't sure. I wanted to know what it told me. Lena was 2 bunks over, sitting up with her back against the bulkhead and a datapad balanced on her knee. The screen cast her face in a pale blue that made the shadows under her eyes look deeper than they'd been that morning. She wasn't reading. I could tell by the way her thumb stayed still on the edge of the pad, not scrolling, not tapping. She was listening to the same thing I was, the soft, intermittent click from the communications relay repeater someone had patched into the compartment's audio panel. Every 4 minutes, a 30-second burst. A small sound, almost apologetic, like a knock on a door you weren't sure anyone was behind. "You're supposed to be off shift," I said. She didn't look up. "So are you." "I'm practicing." That got a half smile, the kind that didn't reach anything but the corner of her mouth. "How's it going?" "I'm terrible at it." She set the datapad down on the blanket and rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. Bell checked on Vale an hour ago. Said the infection's responding to the broad spectrum. He's sleeping. I nodded. I'd stopped by the medical bay before coming to the quarters, stood in the doorway long enough to see Vale's chest rising and falling under a thermal sheet, the bandage on his arm a clean white stripe against the grey of his undershirt. Bell had looked up from a supply inventory and given me a small nod. No words. We'd run out of the easy ones. The repeater clicked. Another burst went out. I imagined it as a ripple moving through dark water, growing fainter the farther it traveled, until it was indistinguishable from the background noise of the universe. Lena had spent 6 years listening to fleet traffic. She knew better than anyone what the odds were of a signal this week finding a receiver that was listening on the right frequency at the right moment. She'd configured the beacon anyway, her fingers moving across the console with the same precision she'd used for 1,000 routine transmissions back when routine was something we still had. "Do you think anyone's out there?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. The blanket swayed. The fan cycled off. "I think the beacon's working," she said. "That's all I can know." It wasn't an answer, but it was the truth, and I'd learned over the past 4 days that the truth and an answer weren't always the same thing. I closed my eyes again and let the ship's sounds settle around me, the distant whir of a pump struggling to maintain pressure in the number 2 coolant loop, the creak of a bulkhead adjusting to thermal stress, the soft static of the audio panel between bursts. The Resolute Dawn was a wounded vessel, 41 of her crew gone, and 12 more fighting for recovery in a medical bay that had been a storage compartment before the battle. But she was still holding atmosphere, still generating power, still sending her small, stubborn signal into the dark. I thought about Nguyen, who I'd known well enough to nod to in the corridor and not well enough to have ever sat down with for a meal. I thought about the conduit tunnel at frame 31, where I'd spent hours pulling cable with hands that had stopped feeling like my own. I thought about Vale, who had signed off on the number 2 coolant loop at 0600 on a morning that felt like it belonged to a different lifetime, and who had collapsed in the communications array compartment rather than admit he was bleeding. I thought about Lena, sitting 2 bunks away with a data pad she wasn't reading, keeping watch over a signal she couldn't hear with her ears, but felt in the rhythm of her own breathing. I'd been a technician when I came aboard 18 months ago. I'd known the ship by its schematics, its maintenance schedules, its amber warning lights, and its 62 hertz hum. I'd known my place in it, a name on a duty roster, a set of hands that could swap a coupling or trace a short. The war had been an abstraction, a distant thing that happened to other ships and other crews. I'd believed, in the unexamined way, that people believe things that have never been tested, that competence and routine were a kind of armor. They weren't. The armor had cracked, but what was underneath had held. The repeater clicked. Another burst. Lena shifted on her bunk, pulling the blanket up over her shoulders, and I heard her exhale slowly, the way people do when they've decided to trust something they can't verify. The ship groaned, a long, low sound that traveled through the deck plate and into my spine, and I didn't try to name it or measure it. I just let it be there, a fact among other facts. The beacon was transmitting, Vale was sleeping, the hull was holding, and we were still here. I closed my eyes. The fan cycled. The blanket swayed. Somewhere in the dark, a small sound kept going, asking the same question over and over. waiting for someone to answer.